What's up, everybody? I'm really excited for today's video. I'm going to be experimenting with a whole bunch of wet and wet acrylic techniques. I'm going to show you how I do gradients. I'm also going to show you how to make mud, which I think a lot of people are trying to avoid, but sometimes can be very beautiful. Yeah, so a lot of fun experimentation today. I think this is going to be a good one, so stick around. So I'm going to start with gradients because I think that's the main reason that people want to know how to paint with acrylic, wet and wet. I think they're trying probably to achieve a gradient or a smooth transition. When I do paint with gradients, I use a very specific technique, so I'll show you how that works. I got a whole bunch of colors here. Just going to experiment a little bit. I'm going to be painting on watercolor paper. Normally I would gesso this paper and seal it in. I actually just forgot to do that, but that's definitely an important step. The main reason is that as you're painting wet and wet, especially getting a lot of paint on the paper, at some point the paper will start to rip and tear. So I think another thing that people are concerned about is making mud, right? So when you're working on a painting and the colors mush all together and just become muddy and brown, and it's really frustrating. There's several factors to consider to avoid. I'm going to show later in this video exactly how mud happens. But one factor is the colors that you choose. So there's different temperatures of colors, right? So there's warm yellows and cool yellows, believe it or not, and warm greens and cool greens and so on. And here I have a cool green, which is phthalo. The yellow has, if not a little bit of blue in it, it definitely doesn't have any red in it, the one that I'm going to be using. So you can see the difference here between a cadmium yellow, which has a little bit of red hue, versus the brighter yellow. I don't know the name of it. I'm going to show you kind of how those things look compared to each other. So I'm going to show you a couple different techniques to do this, but the one I prefer to use is using a very wide brush and just putting the two colors you want to mix together in a gradient on the brush at the same time. And as you can see here, a little bit of water helps as well. So again, the opacity and things like that all contribute. You just have to experiment with this and sort of figure it out. But a little bit of water will help in this case. It's sort of a random thought, but I hate wasting materials. And in this exercise, I'm just painting and experimenting, and I'll end up saving these backgrounds for something. I'll end up using them in paintings down the road. I won't just throw them out or anything like that. And as you can see, when I have extra paint left over on my brush, I end up adding it to other backgrounds that I've started that are laying around, just because I can't stand the idea that these things will go to waste. Now I'm going to end up trying some cadmium yellow with that same phthalo green, just to show you the difference in the hue and the gradient. And actually, this turned out not as muddy as I thought it would, and I want to talk just a little bit about why that is. So the more colors you add and mix wet and wet, the more likely you are to make mud. So here in the beginning, there was just primary yellow, green, and a little bit of blue, because the blue is in the phthalo. And now there's yellow, green, blue, and red also, because there's a little bit of red in the cad yellow. So the additional color, you run the risk of getting a little bit of muddy color with that. But these both turned out pretty nice actually. So here I'm adding a little bit more actual cad red into the mix, just so you can start to see a little bit of the muddiness coming in and how that works. And then I'm also going to you can see, experimenting with building up the paint thicker and kind of scratching into it with a palette knife, how I like to paint wet and wet. There's much more of that later in the video, so stick around for that. I'm also going to show you a really great example of how to make mud later, and it's actually a really pretty color, so just hang out because those things are really cool, and I think you'll learn a lot from that. Here I'm going to use a different technique where I put the paint on the paper first. I'm using some magenta and titanium white, and I'm going to use a smaller brush just to blend all these together. I'm using a fan brush, but that's only because it was a clean brush and it was nearby. You can use any brush you really want. A flat brush is better though, and I think, than a round brush in this instance. As you can see, you can blend things together fairly nicely too. The acrylic actually stays wet a little longer than you may think, especially if you apply it thicker. And as long as you use a light touch, you can continue to add different colors and just blend it in very soft. But I think this takes time to, I think, get a handle on this. I was thinking about it. It's kind of interesting. With oil paint, you're always painting wet and wet, right? Unless you're applying glazes after the oil has dried. Typically oil, which I haven't painted a lot with oil, but I know it takes days to weeks to even months to dry fully. So you're always painting wet and wet. And so it's interesting that acrylic, most of the time you're painting in layers and letting the paint dry so fast. You're just adding layers on top of layers. or maybe blending in different ways, like using dry brushing or other techniques. But painting wet in wet is kind of it's a unique thing to acrylic, only because you have to go pretty quickly, and I think it's just you're kind of working against the nature of the materials, if that makes any sense. The paint wants to dry quickly, and you're trying to keep it active. Now there are additives that you can use, mediums, other things that slow the drying process down. I honestly haven't played with those too much, and I find that the thicker you apply the paint, the longer it stays active. Now I'm going to start to get into some of how I normally paint wet and wet, and some of the techniques that I use to try to achieve what I think are some pretty interesting effects, and hopefully you'll feel the same. So most of the time when I'm doing abstract painting and I'm painting wet and wet, this is the type of thing I'm doing. I'm putting on lots of different colors, thick. There's a little bit of a trick to this. Like, you lay these things down in thick sections, I guess, and you can mix them, but like I'm mixing them with a very skinny palette knife. You can use a stick or the back of your brush or whatever. Hopefully the video is making it clear what's actually going on, but I'm mixing the paint without thoroughly mixing it, if that makes any sense. And later I'm going to show you very soon here how to make a complete mess of this and turn it into mud, which it ends up being a very beautiful color that I've used before for backgrounds and things like that. So we'll see what you guys think about it. But yeah, with this I'm trying to achieve a really abstract aesthetic. There's kind of an ombre effect, and there's a lot of happenstance and sort of randomness that's going on that I just think creates these really beautiful textures and interesting interesting aesthetics that I don't think I could get any other way. And here's a small example of the type of paintings I've done in the past using this technique. Just a little bird. This is really interesting. So I'm using all the same colors that we've been using already. The same exact greens, yellows, reds, a little bit of blue, a little bit of black. And I'm just going to now, with very little thought to keeping the paint separate as I put it down, I'm just going to throw it onto a piece of paper and then thoroughly mix it using a round brush. And you can see what the effect of that is. So maybe the video hopefully makes it clear what's going on, but the more you mix this and the more you continue to work it and the more colors that you have, the quicker and the more likely it is to turn into just a brown gray mess, I guess is what most people would think. Again, it's a beautiful color, and I think you can use this to create amazing grays and browns and tones. Essentially, if you remove the black from this, it would just be a lighter gray. And so it's really interesting to me that all these colors come together to make this kind of thing. And I think that's what a lot of people run into when they're trying to make gradients or blend acrylic paint, or even, I'm sure oil's very similar, same way. It's the way pigment works. So I'm going to show you here that how I just don't give up on stuff like this. And again, I'm not trying to make a final painting here. I'm just showing you that as I'm working on a painting, if I start to make these unpleasant tones or things that I'm not trying to achieve, I just continue to add paint right on top of it. And in this case, because there's so much paint already on the paper, it helps the new paint that I add stay wet. And so you can continue to work it. And again, you have to be careful here because you can start to tear the paper if you haven't sealed it or gessoed it. But this stuff can work on wood, it can work on canvas, any other painting material background that you're painting on. But you can see that if you continue to just put the paint down fairly thick and not over mix it, you can get some really neat effects while painting wet on wet. And this is starting to look like a sunset or some sort of a landscape to me, and I could just see how there's a lot of potential for where you could take this. Now I'm going to show you one more technique that I think is really kind of fun, and I do this sometimes where I have a random background that's a bunch of wet paint, and then I take another piece of paper or material and sort of smush it down on top of the wet paint, and then peel it off to create these strange like print. I'm not sure exactly what you call them, but they're almost like block prints, but and they're sort of abstract, random results that I think are beautiful. And again, you could then push that as far as you want it. And here I've got several other paintings that I'd already started or pours that I'd already done, and I'm just experimenting with what does it look like when I put those together and lift the paint off and see kind of what I can get by experimenting and playing. It's really fun. I enjoy doing this. And like I said, this video is not about a final piece of art or trying to make a painting. I'm kind of showing you all how I approach abstract painting, especially with wet on wet, and how I like to just play with the materials and push it as far as I can, and just see what I can come up with. And then the entire time I'm learning, and again, you can get different results obviously by using different color combinations. And again, there's like 1,000 different ways in which you can experiment, and I think it just takes time to kind of get a handle. I'm still getting a handle on it, honestly. Even starting this video, I wasn't even quite sure which colors I should choose, which would be the best to communicate some of the things that I wanted to share. So I think you have to give it a go. And one thing about color biases, I talked about that a little bit in the beginning. A cool green will mix with a cooler yellow. It tends to be more harmonious and more vibrant than if you mix a cool green with a warmer yellow. And that goes for the entire color wheel. So again, there's really good videos out there explaining that, and it also just takes time. You have to experiment with it and play. I hope this is helpful. It's really fun for me to play with these things and share what I do know with you all. Let me know if there's anything in particular you'd like to see more of, or anything that really stood out to you that you liked. Or I mean, there's tons that I obviously don't know about this stuff. I'm always learning too. So let me know like what your experiences are. What you've seen success with when painting this way with wet and acrylic. Yeah. So thanks for joining me. I'm gonna keep playing. Take care. Peace.